Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson. I am the host of a podcast known as Life Along the Merrimack. We're on 96.3 radio and cable, Comcast cable TV. And we're going to talk today about clean rivers, how the Merrimack River got clean. In front of you, you should be able to see a graphic of a book titled Merrimack, the Resilient River, an illustrated profile of the most historic river in New England. And this is a book I just wrote. It hasn't hit the stores yet. That's April 25th. So you can take solace in the fact this is not a commercial promotion, but this is the book that I wrote, and it's spring and a lot of people are concerned about the fact the river is getting dirtier, not cleaner. And so I wanted to read a chapter from my book that talks about clean rivers. And it talks about how we did get clean rivers. Now, the Merrimack is 117 miles long. It has many factories on it in Manchester, Haverhill, Lawrence, Lowell, other places, and a great deal of pollution still goes in the river. And most of us have grown up hearing the expression environmental movement, or we hear clean water funding and things like that. But there was no environmental movement until 1970, and that's what I want to talk about. That's how the Merrimack River got clean, following the Clean Water Act of 1972. But I have a whole list of steps that were taken with the Merrimack and with other rivers that finally brought us clean water. And what I'm going to do now is just read highlights from a chapter that I wrote. And the name of the chapter is Timeline of a Cleaner America. And I'm going to go by year because it's interesting. Again, there was no environmental movement, but here we start. The first stirrings of it was in 1962 when the author Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring. And it's got people thinking about, well, we need insects, we need fish, we need, wetlands. And so Rachel Carson was a real strong force early in the day. And she was ridiculed by many senators, many chauvinist senators, if I can say, but she was a very brave woman because no one was talking about a clean environment in 1962. In 1969, a major event occurred. There was a fire on the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. Yes, it was in the river. The Cuyahoga River was so polluted, it had so much effluent and so many chemicals in it that it actually caught fire. And this really shocked America, that a river could catch fire. Everyone knew that water was polluted. Here in Newburyport, the Merrimack was very dirty through the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. I mean, kids couldn't go swimming. A lot of people didn't want to take their boats out. And the Merrimack, like many other rivers, was terribly polluted. But after 1969, there was a movement to do something about it. In 1970, President Richard Nixon signed a federal bill which created the Council on Environmental Quality, which later became the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, Nixon eventually turned out to be a rogue, I must say that. But because there was so much desire to clean up rivers and lakes and the oceans, that he went along and there was bipartisan support. In April 1970 was the first Earth Day. I think we've all heard that. In fact, I think the time of it has changed a few times, but people started being concerned. In 1970, December, the Clean Air Act of 1970 was created. It wasn't just the water, of course. People were concerned about the air. I grew up in New Jersey, and one of the old saws down there was, if you can't see the air, don't trust it. There was a lot of air pollution in New Jersey. There were many factories along the Hudson River and elsewhere. But the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970. In 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed, and this really helped the Merrimack River. Edmund Muskie, the senator from Maine, was a leader in getting that passed. He had 33 different public hearings around the country, and people were basically saying, we need federal aid to clean water sewage treatment plants. There's too much effluent going into the rivers. Also, there was very little regulation of factories and mills, and the Merrimack River is certainly an example of that. So in 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed. And I must say that we already mentioned it, President Richard Nixon, it happened on his watch that the EPA was approved. So that's good. But when the Clean Water Act of 1972 came along, he vetoed it. Imagine that. So, but there was bipartisan support in those days. And by a big margin, the veto was overturned. So we had a Clean Water Act, and this provided block grants for places like Newburyport and Lawrence and Lowell and Manchester, New Hampshire, places along the river that had been polluting with their sewage treatment plants. So they started getting grants and they started improving the treatment of sewage. Also, there was much more regulation on what chemicals you could put into the river. And we just saw in Ohio, the Cuyahoga River had an enormous amount. And so all rivers started getting some more regulation. And I have my tennis partner here in Newburyport, Dick Canepa, who grew up in the 50s, and he taught a long time at Pentucket High School, incidentally. But he would be swimming in the 50s and early 60s. And if he wouldn't be swimming, he'd be on the river. And he remembers, if we fell into the river, we'd have to run home. Our mothers would put us into the bathtub. And it was a very serious proposition. If you fell into the river, say in the 50s or 60s, it was very dirty. So in 1972, the Clean Water Act started, and a lot of federal money came in for grants. And that was a major, major reason why the river started getting cleaner. In 1972, also, the Environmental Protection Agency banned DDT. So that was a pesticide. The health effects on animals and people was quite bad. So that was put away in 1972 as well. In 1972, also, the Ocean Dumping Act was passed. Now, it seems odd that, nowadays we think, well, there are strong regulations against dumping in the ocean. But in those days, as we have said, many companies dump directly into the ocean. The city of New York, for many years, had these barges that would go out about 10 miles and just let it go into the ocean. So we see that a lot was happening in the early 70s. In 73, the Auto Maintenance Regulation Act was passed, and that started a trend towards having less pollution from automobiles and putting more regulation into the auto industry. Now, this annoyed many people, particularly in Detroit and other places, but it did pass. And so more science was created to clean up the air and the water. In 1974, the Safe Drinking Water Act was passed, and that made it federal regulation on drinking water. That was enormously important for places on the Merrimack River because some of the science wasn't that great and people occasionally got sick from river water. Now in Newburyport, we do not get our drinking water from the river. We get it from the Artichoke and a couple other large wells. We are fortunate. But in Lowell, Lawrence, and Haverhill, many of those places got their drinking water from the river. So that was very important to have it clean. And I want to say that nowadays, as I wrote this book, one of the most surprising elements of it was to learn that several communities still get their drinking water from the Merrimack River. Now, the science is much better, and there are significant regulations, but 500,000 people still get their water to drink from the Merrimack River. To me, that's remarkable. And that includes Lawrence, North Andover, parts of Lowell, parts of Andover. So that's another reason why we have to make sure that the water is clean and that the chemicals that are poured into the river, even today, are regulated. It's very important. There were other elements that happened. In 1977, the Clean Water Act was passed, which made regulations even stronger. So this was a good decade in the 70s, but bad things can happen to good people. In 1978, the Love Canal disaster took place. And if you weren't around, people in upstate New York, Love Canal was the name of the area, found out that chemicals were leaking into their drinking water, and the pollution was a very serious hazard. It's kind of like, I think, what happened in Flint, Michigan in the past few years. And that reminds some people about the value of regulation. At the Love Canal, regulation got lax and drinking water was tainted, as did happen in Flint, Michigan. So it's always been a lot of political activity that goes along with the desire to have cleaner water. Now, in the past couple of years, local legislators have really stepped up the pace of trying to get federal money for sewage treatment plants and also stronger regulations. State Senator Diana DiZoglio from Methuen was instrumental in pushing the Merrimack River Commission. That was passed. She and Jim Kelcourse, state representative, were helpful in getting Governor Baker to sign a measure that requires sewage plants upriver to warn people downriver when they've had a discharge. One of the most serious elements about pollution on the Merrimack River is after a rainstorm, there are discharges which include a lot of effluent or pollution. The old sewage treatment plants were structured so that rainwater from the pipes goes into the sewage treatment plant, as well as liquid sewage from our homes and industries. In most cases, the sewage treatment plant in Lowell and Haverhill and Lawrence, they can accommodate that. But after heavy rains, and they've been happening more so because of climate change, after heavy rains, the treatment plant can't absorb it all, and it releases the whole amount of liquid. It's called a combined liquid discharge. And so we get a great deal of effluent coming down the river. So Governor Baker did sign a bill which said, well, say Lowell does this, they have a discharge, and that means millions of gallons of pollution, effluent is coming down river. They have to have a system, a website, an email, perhaps even signals on the river that tell people we've had a discharge upriver. Now, they haven't figured all the details out, but this is another important change as people continue to work for cleaner water. Now, we're going back to our chronology, which again, this is not me coming up with it, but the Environmental Protection Agency. In 1980, Congress created the Superfund Program, which put billions of dollars towards cleanup efforts of sewage treatment plants. That was very good. In 1985, the federal government called for a 90% reduction of lead in gasoline. Now, granted, that's air, not water, but that was very important. And I think some of us can remember when people talked about the cutting down of lead in gasoline. In 1986, there was a Wetlands Protection Act. And here on the North Shore, wetlands are a very big deal. In fact, the marsh that exists in Salisbury and up the river, that is the largest marsh north of New Jersey. It's very important for fish, for birds, for insects. And in 1980, 1986 was the Wetlands Protection Act. And we certainly benefit from that. Now, I am speaking about breakthroughs in environmental protection. Again, my name is Dyke Hendrickson. This is a podcast known as Life Along the Merrimack. It's on 96.3 Joppa Radio, Comcast Local TV Channel 9 as well. And we went from to 1988, we had the sewage ocean dumping ban. Now, as I started to say, and it's hard to believe it, but it's true, that many communities were still dumping a lot of just garbage, tons of garbage into the river, not into the river, but into the ocean. And here I have 1992, New York City stops dumping. So in 1992, that was the first time that communities were told, you know, you have a year to come up with a new program. You cannot dump your garbage into the Atlantic Ocean. And again, this is New York City, but it went for many people. So, you know, if we are making progress, and it is true, it's remarkable to think that as recent as 92, New York was putting its garbage straight into the ocean. In 1994, the Brownfields program was created. Some of you may remember that many communities have had brownfields. These are sites or parcels that are contaminated with all different kinds of bad things, chemicals, pollution, whatever. You know, years ago, there was a very serious case in Woburn, Massachusetts. A number of youngsters died because it became known these brown fields were leaking effluent and poisons into the drinking water. Also, it's happened in many different communities, and it was a serious situation. But in 1994, the Brownfields program was created, and it's, you know, done a good turn for everybody. I would mention that here in Newburyport, we were fortunate about having a brownfield removed. There was a brownfield at the corner of Route 1 and where it comes into Hill Street. Now, a developer named David Hall is building numerous apartments and abodes there. It's a very busy intersection, but for years that was a brownfield. And so he, to his credit, went and got state and federal grants and said, I will clean up this place if you'll help me. So you won't have a brownfield anymore, and we'll have, you know, scores of new residences. They're not for sale, they're rental, but you may have seen that again, Route 1 and Hill Street. So that was an interesting situation. In our case, a brownfield existed, a private developer looked upon it, and he was able to get some funding from the state, and he's doing actually a nice job on making residences there. In 1995, there were Municipal Waste Combustor Act, which made stronger regulations for cities that communities would have to have incinerators. They couldn't just bury the waste anymore, but they had to have incinerators for household and commercial waste. The idea was to reduce toxics, and I think that's been viewed as quite successful also. In 2002, the Hudson River cleanup started, and that was a situation where there was many chemicals going into the Hudson River. That separates New York and New Jersey. There's a lot of recreation there now, but like many communities, it got extraordinarily polluted over the years. So in 2002, there was federal action to, rid the river of PCB contamination, and so that's been helpful. In 2009, greenhouse gas, there was a bill about greenhouse gases, and we've talked a lot about greenhouse gases in recent years. 2009 was one of the first steps to tackle the problem and learn how the greenhouse gases are leading to climate change and what might be done about it. So that was in addition to the Clean Air Act. But again, you can see these things happening slowly, perhaps, but they are happening. In 2015, the Clean Water Rule protects critical streams and wetlands. Now, that was a situation that was actually going in the other direction. It was a situation where people wanted cleaner wetlands, and so federal regulations were able to do that. And on the North Shore, that is particularly important. we have many streams. We have the marsh, as we discussed. And so streams and wetlands are very important. Now, in 2017, during the Trump administration, things started going in a different direction. Internationally, the US withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord. Of course, that didn't affect the Merrimack River per se, but since this is a recitation of what happened over the last 50 years in legislation, this was a blow because the US had been at the forefront of cleaning rivers like the Merrimack and the Atlantic Ocean. But when we withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord, that was a serious situation. And 2017 also, the EPA under the Trump administration was started to rescind or negate some of the Clean Water Act rules. And for wetlands particularly, that it threatened wetlands. And it seemed to be saying, well, we're not going to be regulating the corporations or the mills anymore. You can do what you want. And it wasn't that black and white, but nevertheless, it was a big scare in many of the people. And in 2017 also, the EPA proposed the repeal of the Clean Power Plan. And that was a situation where it would, President Obama had created many regulations to improve clean water and clean air. This was the EPA proposing a repeal of some of those reforms. Now, EPA people do what they're told. I mean, most of them have good hearts. In fact, for this book, I interviewed several people who had worked at the EPA in the 70s and 80s. And then I asked them about, well, what about the, excuse me, what about the Trump administration? And they said, well, we have to do what we're told. We take our orders. We're employees. A lot of people weren't happy, but nevertheless, it did go in a different direction or flowing the wrong way, if I can use the term. So now we have a different administration, and it appears some of the Trump revisions are going to be repealed. I think there'll be more regulation. The EPA will once again try to do a better job with cleaning water and cleaning air. But the takeaway from this presentation is in the last 50 years, we have had significant federal and state regulation that has really helped the Merrimack River. Now, last summer of 2019, a group of state and federal legislators and employees went down the entire length of the Merrimack River. It's 117 miles from Franklin, New Hampshire. They got into kayaks and they came all the way down the river. It took them 4 days. But they wanted to bring out, they were called the Voyagers. And some of the people I've already mentioned, Jim Kelcourse, Diana DiZoglio, Mayor Holliday of Newburyport was part of it for a period of time. They wanted to show that the river is a great asset. And they also wanted to talk about some of the problems in the river. In some areas, Methuen comes to mind because I have a couple pictures of Methuen in my book. You know, there's all sorts of debris there. I think over the years, if you read local papers, there have been found bicycles outside of Lawrence in the river. There have been bicycles, there have been tires, there have been cars pulled out of the river. And sometimes even down here, we're at the end of the river, of course, hypodermic needles have been pulled out of the Merrimack. So I think the Voyagers prove something to me, at least. There's a great deal of many assets to the Merrimack, but there's still a lot of challenge to it. And one reason I wrote this book, the first sentence says, this book is part history and part call to action. In other words, I documented the pollution on the rivers with the mills, with the dumping, with the discharges, but the book also brings out the many assets of the river. And if you can see the cover, I think you can see the top picture is in Franklin, New Hampshire. It shows the beauty of the river. It probably looked that way 4 centuries ago. Downriver, you've seen on the bottom of the cover is Newburyport, taken by a drone, I might say. Ethan Cohen is a local chap in town. He has a drone photography company. He took the photo, which I paid him for, by the way. Anyway, so things have improved greatly. Spring is coming. I know a lot of people want to go out fishing. They want to go out boating. Upriver, beyond Lowell, actually, there's numerous areas where you can go swimming. One of the good things about cleaning up the river is that Manchester, New Hampshire, which is a large city, which is a largest city in our area, they recently came to an agreement with the federal and state environmental professionals, and they said they are going to put $132 million into their sewage treatment plant. They are the biggest polluter on the Merrimack River. I'm saying the city of Manchester. But they have entered into a 20-year agreement, $132 million, to improve their sewage treatment plant. So that didn't get a lot of attention, I didn't think. To me, it's an enormous step forward. But we should be aware of these things, and we should be aware of the many things that we can do to clean the river. One of them might be talking to our elected officials. There is federal money to improve sewage treatment plants. It's a revolving low-interest program, 1.5%, as a matter of fact. So that's one of the elements. So this has been our podcast for Tuesday. I'm Dyke Hendrickson. This is 96.3 Joppa Radio and Channel 9 Comcast Television. I enjoy reporting on the river. And, for me, the history of the river is intriguing. And the last 50 years, it's been marked by a lot of environmental improvement. Senator Ed Muskie of Maine was very valuable. Senator George Mitchell, also of Maine, was very valuable in pushing past the Clean Water Act, and in Mitchell's case in 1987, in passing amendments that would enable the improvement program to continue. So it's been a long battle. We've had a lot of mills, a lot of pollution over the years. Things are getting better. And for myself, I really enjoyed this research. The book is Merrimack, the Resilient River. It's not for sale quite yet, but it does, as I say, part history, part call to action. We will be back next week. We'll talk about the health and history of the river once again. Thank you very much for being here. And it's springtime, and a lot more people are going to the river, I notice. Some of the moorings are being set up right now. It's been cool, but it hasn't been so rainy. So I believe many people are looking forward to get out in the river. And we'll also talk in the future about Plum Island. Plum Island, of course, is adjacent to the river. There are many interesting stories about that. I look forward to more talking. So this has been Life Along the Merrimack. I'm Dyke Hendrickson, and thank you for being with us. And we'll talk and listen again next week. Bye-bye.